was pretty stressed out, but I never thought I would have a complete emotional breakdown over some Kit Kats. Yes, I'm talking about the chocolate bar. I started my career in forestry, and then I traded that in for a desk job, but after several years of feeling the computer keyboard in my hand, I needed to feel dirt in my hand again. So through various channels, I landed this volunteer opportunity to help manage this tree planting project at this private estate. It was a residential retreat in Scotland, and I jumped on it. Well, I ended up staying for 2 years there instead of just the 6 months, and I ended up doing a heck of a lot more than just plant trees, but that's another dozens of stories for another time. Braemar got the money for this tree planting project from a nonprofit whose mission was to encourage and support public and private landowners to plant native Scottish trees. Several centuries ago, Britain's forests had been cut down, a lot of their native forests had been cut down, and then back in the 1950s and 60s, the Forestry Commission started planting these blocks of North American Sitka spruce. And these are not native to Britain, and they're a bit of an environmental nightmare because they're not native. They're planted basically as a crop, just like corn, and they're cut down for paper pulp. And they're planted in these really tight blocks, and no light gets through, so nothing much grows in the understory because it's so dark. Plus, the trees leach nutrients from the soil, and they just don't have that much value to wildlife. Well, Braemar had about 200 acres of land, and most of it was sheep pasture, but some of it was in these spruce plantations, and some of them had been logged. So Braemar wanted to revitalize these with native Scottish species, and these were things like beech and oak and ash and willow and holly, things like that. Now, as part of the stipulation for getting this grant money, it wasn't only planting these thousands of trees scattered all over the estate, but it was also taking care of a bunch of trees, several thousand in fact, that had been planted the year before. So I got taken on to do phase 2 of this project. Phase 1, they had already planted several thousand trees. Phase 2 was planting several thousand more trees. Plus we had to weed through the trees that were planted the previous year. And I'll explain what that means. All of the seedlings, every single one of them, are planted in the ground, then they're covered with these plastic sleeves, and they're called tree tubes because that's what they are. And they're attached to these wooden stakes that are driven into the ground. And the tubes, you've probably seen them around here, they protect the young seedlings from rabbits and deer because they would eat them, and they also kind of give them a head start from the climate. Well, weeding involved just pulling the grass out because the grass grows in these tubes too, and they can choke out these seedlings. So that was also part of the project. Well, I had emailed invitations to the worldwide greater Braemar community, and these were people who were involved with Braemar over the years with this retreat center. And I got responses from more than 100 people who wanted to come out and help plant trees. And they were people who, they were families and friends of families and friends of friends, and they ranged in age from 3 years to 75 years, and they came from all kinds of backgrounds and professions. It was a real mixed bag of folks. And the tree planting was only going to be for 2 weeks in April, but not everybody was coming for the whole 2 weeks. Some people were coming for just a day, and some people for a few days, some people for a week, and a couple of people were staying for the whole 2 weeks. And they were staying at Braemar because we had cottages and a dormitory, and we had a big house, the manor house. And we also had 6 to 8 volunteers on staff who were going to help support this planting by cooking the 3 meals a day for the planters. And then they were also going to help prepare the coffee and tea and snacks for morning and afternoon breaks. And they also made up the beds because there were people coming and going constantly, new people. So they would make up the new beds, and they did the laundry and things like that. Now we had set up a MASH-style tent about 1/4 of a mile away from the big house, and it was centrally located to all the areas where we were going to be planting these trees. And the purpose of this tent was we were serving lunches in there because we didn't want the tree planters to have to traipse all the way back to the big house for lunch. Some of the planting areas were as far as a 1/2 mile away. Remember, this is a huge estate. And we could not afford to waste precious time having these people traipse back and forth. You know, we needed to get this job done. Yeah, we had 100 people, but we only had 2 weeks to do this. So, so we had this MASH tent. And now the key to keeping the planters happy and working was to serve them sugar-laden snacks for their morning and afternoon breaks. In the morning, we served them these gorgeous cakes and cookies that were home-baked. We had a volunteer baker just doing that. And then in the afternoon, we served them Kit Kats. And I had learned, someone told me this, that the year before, somebody had brought Kit Kats and they were a huge hit, so we had to have Kit Kats because supposedly they had this magical, motivating energy to keep people working after lunch. And I was like, okay, let's do it. Let's buy Kit Kats. Well, we had 100 people, and that's a lot of Kit Kats, and it's a lot of money, and this was a poor nonprofit, so we had to ration those. Well, now, this project was huge. It had a lot of moving parts, and it required a lot of careful management of people and materials and all kinds of stuff. And it was also really important to me personally because I cared deeply about these trees. I understood the importance that forests play in climate control for our planet. And I felt so honored to be part of this nationwide project to help reforest Scotland. I knew that it was good for the land, and it was good for the wildlife, and it was good for the soul. But I also had some concerns because getting the grant money depended on whether we got this project done, and not everybody was super hard worker. We did have a group of people that did work really hard. They knew what they were doing, they'd done it before, and they just cracked on with it, and that was great. But everybody else, it was kind of a social thing, meeting up at Braemar and seeing old friends again. And so I had to kind of motivate some people, and I was also running around making sure that all the materials were replenished as we moved through the planting areas. And I was doing quality control because some of the people didn't quite get that they had to plant, that they had to bury the roots under the soil. So, there were always new people coming and going, and they didn't quite get the hang of it. So we were always showing people again and again every day, here's how you properly plant a tree. And I had to make sure that the stakes and the tree tubes were properly secured, that there were no gaps underneath for the rabbits and deer to get under and the weather to get in, and so that the plants would die, the trees would die. And sometimes I helped pull people and small children out of the boggy areas when they got stuck. And there was also this group of guys that I called the young lads. They were ranged in age from their teens to their early 20s, and they were the most able-bodied, but they did the least amount of work. No surprise. They slept in till 11 or 12, and when they did get out in the field, they flirted with the girls a little bit more than they actually did any work. So I had to figure out how I motivate these guys, and I'm trying to crack the whip. It's like, we got these thousands of trees to plant, we got all these other trees that we need to weed through, let's get moving, guys. So part of my motivation involved threatening to take their Kit Kats away, which worked to a certain extent. Well, after the first week, the hardest working volunteers went home. They had put in their time and they went home. And then some of the house staff decided that they really needed to go attend this seminar in England for several days. So that left us short-handed. And on top of doing everything else that I was doing, that meant I had to start taking over managing the morning and afternoon tea and coffee breaks with the goodies. And I wasn't getting any rest at all. I was working 16-hour days easily, and even in the evenings after supper, everybody wanted a piece of me. It was the tree planters were, Sarah, can I have an extra towel, or can I have an extra pillow, or can you put me in another room because the guy sleeping next to me is snoring too loud. And then from the support staff side, it was, Sarah, tell the tree planters to stop tracking mud in the house and tell them they got to help wash dishes after supper, and no, they can't have extra towels and pillows, we don't have enough. So I was starting to kind of go crazy, and on top of this, now I got to do these tea breaks. So that meant that wherever I was in the field, wherever we were planting, I had to hike back to the MASH tent, and I had to start the tea water boiling. We had this propane boiler, water boiler thingy, and I had to get that going, and then I had to walk a quarter-mile back to the house to get the goodies that had been baked that day, and I'd walk back to the mash tent, and I'd make the tea, and then a little while later, a couple of volunteers would come in from the field, and we'd pack everything in boxes, and we'd take the stuff out to the field, to the tree planters. One day I was making tea, and I discovered I only had 5 tea bags in the mash tent. I did not have time to go back to the house to get more tea bags. I was in a rush, and we were under a time crunch here. So I have to stop and tell you at this point that in case you weren't aware, the British like their tea really strong. So while 5 bags of tea for 3 gallons of water might cut it for an American, it doesn't quite do the trick for the British. Well, I made the tea anyway, and come on, people, the water came out brown, so it's tea, right? Wrong, I found out the hard way. Several minutes after I had sent the food out to the field, this woman comes to the tent, one of the volunteers. Her name was Christine, and I knew that the tree planters had chosen her as their emissary because she was ever so nice, and she was the least likely to bash me over the head with a tea kettle. And she says, had there been a mix-up? Had I mistakenly put dirty dishwater in the flasks instead of tea? And through tears, I confessed my sins, and I said, look, I'm losing it here. I'm super stressed out. I'm doing all this stuff. You see me working, and now you expect me to make British-style tea on top of all this? And she promised to drop deportation proceedings if I promised never to make tea again. And that was a great deal, I thought. And she also promised to rustle up some volunteers to help. And that was great for a few days until those volunteers left. And then we started to, and then I had to take over that job again. And then we started to run out of goodies, because our baker also just decided he was done, and he left Braemar, and occasionally that happened. So now I had to resort to store-bought cookies, and the tree planters started to complain, and then I had heard rumors that the young lads were raiding the pantry at night. So that's when I hid the last of our Kit Kats. So we're coming to the end of this planting, and I'm starting to get really nervous. My nerves are frayed. I haven't had any sleep for nearly 2 weeks. I am cracking the whip now. Like, come on, you guys, we still have so much work to do, and we're not going to get it all done. I was worried we weren't going to get our grant money if we didn't get it done. And I had even started to lose faith in the survival of these trees. I mean, these things were leafless twigs that were smaller around than the diameter of my pinky, and they were only about 12 to 16 inches long, so it was like we were just shoving sticks in the ground. So I'm losing faith, and we get down kind of toward the end of the 2-week period, and I thought, okay, today I'm going to get on top of the chaos that's going to happen later, and I'm going to get the goodies together early in the morning so I don't have to deal with them later. So I go to the kitchen, and I go into the pantry, and I get out the step ladder, and I climb to the top step, and I'm reaching way up high for this cookie tin of Kit Kats, and that's where I hid them, up behind some boxes of tea, which technically I wasn't allowed to touch anymore, but I grabbed the Kit Kats, and the tin felt suspiciously lightweight, and I shook it, and I didn't hear anything. And I opened the tin, and there was nothing in it except for my blurry reflection in the bottom of the tin staring back at me. And I thought, that's it. No more Kit Kats. The tree planters are gonna quit. We're never gonna finish this work. The trees that don't get in the ground are gonna die. The wildlife is never gonna come. And 50 years from now, our grandkids are gonna hate us for the miserable failures that we are. Well, my knees started to buckle, and I had to grab the shelf for support. And I just started to sob. Long, deep, heavy, uncontrollable, inconsolable sobs. When everybody else learned that I had lost it, they stepped up their game. And in the end, we planted 9,000 tree seedlings, which was 3,000 more than we were supposed to plant, according to the terms of the grant. We had weeded through more than half of the 11,000 trees that were planted the year before, and I was mighty pleased. Several years after I left Braemar, volunteers came to continue to plant trees and to take care of the trees that we had planted in the previous years until they had grown big enough to survive on their own. And 20 plus years later, those sticks that we were shoving in the ground are this big around, and they're taller than a house, and they're gorgeous. And when I think back on that time, I wonder why I ever had doubted, the ability of a ragtag group of people to create a forest out of mere twigs. And I understand now that seedlings are an invitation to have faith, but you cannot rush a forest. It takes patience and nurture and a whole lot of Kit Kats.